This is Breaking Down Security, and I am Brian Brake. Welcome back, listener. This is Brian. We got a full crew. It's Mr. Betcher and Ms. Berlin for Breaking Down Security. Everybody's here.
Oh,
yay.
Yeah. So, if you're listening to this, we are exactly 1 week away from DerbyCon, which I'm ecstatic about because it's like my Christmas. It's my hacker mini camp.
Right?
Yeah.
That's great.
I'm going to be there 2 days earlier than you, Ms. Berlin.
Yeah, you suck.
Mr. Betcher and I, we're gonna be in a hotel room and doing training. What are you doing for training, Mr. Betcher?
Windows kernel programming.
All right. Who's doing your class?
You put me on the spot like this?
Yeah. This is for the bell thing earlier.
Ding.
Oh, you
Ding.
bastard.
So while he's looking his up, because obviously he didn't care enough
John
about
DeGruder.
Who?
John DeGruder.
Okay. Well, while he was looking his up because he didn't care enough to know who the teacher was on the fly, I'm going to be doing...
I wonder if he listens.
Well, I hope he doesn't. I'm doing internal red teaming with Fuzzy Nop, Josh Schwartz. So that'll be good stuff. I'm looking forward to learning me some red teaming and being completely lost because I'm sure we'll get to learn all about the meat pistols and the stuff that we didn't get to.
I'm sure you're quite capable. Your problem is you just don't pay attention. You just need to focus, man. You'll get it.
Sorry, what?
I mean, listening, yeah.
All right. So anyway, I want to get to our guest because he's uber important and he's taken his time out of his travel schedule here to join us. You might have saw him at Black Hat. I think he gave a talk there, as well as if you're in Northern Ireland, he gave a talk just recently at the OWASP AppSec conference there in Belfast in July of 2017?
Yeah, I think that was in May.
All right, May. So the voice you're hearing is Zane Lackey. Welcome, Mr. Lackey, to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me on. I don't know about being an uber important guest, but I'm excited to be here.
Well, you don't work for Uber. You actually are like head of your own company. You're head of your own company, right? Maybe you can tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. My background is actually initially as a pen tester. So I was a pen tester and security researcher for a long time with ISEC Partners, which then got acquired by NCC Group.
Yep.
And a bit after that acquisition, I got an offer from Etsy that was a offer I couldn't refuse to come be their first CISO and kind of build and lead their security program.
Very nice.
And I think what made that so interesting was really that it was them on the East Coast and Netflix on the West Coast that were kind of pioneering what we're now calling DevOps. And I'm happy to share some of that later on down the line here, but it was a pretty crazy jump with a bunch of lessons learned out of that. And then flash forward a few years to about 3.5 years ago, and two colleagues and I from Etsy left Etsy to start Signal Sciences, really around those lessons learned about how can we have a product that really embraces and enables our shift to DevOps and cloud and helps us really defend our web applications and our APIs and our microservices. So it'd be what the marketing people would call like a next gen WAF or a RASP or something like that. I'm clearly not the marketing side, but really what we took out of there was our lessons learned about how are some fundamentally new ways of defending the web applications, the APIs, and microservices that we expose, and turn that into a product you can drop in without having to go do a bunch of learning or tuning or any of the challenges we've all always had as practitioners in that space.
Cool. All right. So that's the vendor side, which we're not necessarily going to talk about. For those of you who are listening, don't leave yet. We're not doing a vendor talk yet. Maybe in the future or something.
Hey, I'm even a vendor now, and I don't want to hear a vendor talk. So I'm with you on that one.
All right. So your talk at AppSec and at Black Hat was called "How to Adapt the SDLC to the Era of DevSecOps or DevOpsSec or SecDevOps or all the other iterations where they've tried to plug security into the DevOps area either before, during, or after."
Exactly.
So I watched the video that we've got on YouTube, which we've added to the show notes. It was quite good. That's the one in the show notes is to the one in Belfast in Northern Ireland. So the one of the first slides that you mentioned is that the idea of security in a DevOps environment, and you mentioned later in the show that there's DevOps and CI/CD, which are different. And I want to talk about why you consider those different. That the way that security needs to shift is from being a gatekeeper to trying to enable velocity in the environment.
Yeah.
What I find difficult in that is that there's a lot of people who are already doing DevOps, and now they're forced to plug security in, and it's failing. So how do we get that culture shift to move in that direction?
Yeah, it's a big challenge. I mean, it was very much exemplified for me, which was my my last day as a pen tester was with a major U.S. healthcare company. And on the final day of that, they would deploy. They were completely waterfall. They would deploy once every 18 months to make any application changes or infrastructure changes. And I left there on a Friday, and I started at Etsy on a Monday because I'm an idiot, and I took no time off. And when I start on Monday morning, and they sit me down and they say, "Great, we deployed to production 20 times a day. Figure out security, go." And the reality is we tried a bunch of things that failed spectacularly with that completely blew up in our faces. And to be truthful, on that first day, one of my first thoughts is like, can we even really do security in this kind of new paradigm, right? That it goes completely against what we have thought about as security professionals for so long that can I even really do anything here? The interesting thing was that I actually went from one end of the spectrum to the other end, which is that if you would have asked me in that first day or week or month or even first few months, like, is this sort of system less secure? I would have said, yeah, absolutely. What I really learned over time is that actually it gives us the ability to be more secure if we do it right. And the reason for that is that no matter what sort of development methodology or infrastructure deployment methodology or anything that we have, we're always going to have vulnerabilities, right? We're always going to have vulnerabilities and issues. And so the reason why the move to DevOps, if we can actually do it in the right way and really embed security, the reason why it can actually be a net positive for security is that for the first time, we have the ability to react. If you think about that waterfall world where if you discover a critical security issue on, say the front page of your web application or something, and it takes you on a normal process 18 months to deploy a fix, and then you go to a DevOps model where maybe, let's say you're deploying once a day, right, 5 times a week, and you've got a critical issue and you need to rush a deployment out. Well, you can probably do it later that day. And so, for those of us who have lived through waterfall deployments and everything in the past, you've had to live through emergency deploys and everything, what an utter nightmare it is. And so this is really where I came out the other end of building and running that security program, really actually drinking the Kool-Aid about DevOps having the ability to make us more secure. Now, the devil is very much in the details of, okay, great, how do we start to embed security in? But from a high level, I think the biggest, most interesting fact for me was that I started with something that I think the thing that a lot of our peers are going through right now as security professionals, which is you're seeing the rise of DevOps and cloud really start to come into your organization. And it feels like it's going to cause way more insecurity. The reality is if we can start to think about changing the way that we've done security and adapting, we can actually come out in a better position as part of it.
Yeah. So the traditional waterfall is you've got different iterations and you have very rigid roles. You have your developer, you have your QA, you have your tester, you have your release managers, you have your change management managers and those things. So in the past, you would security would inject itself into things like QA and testing, where we would often create test cases for the testers, or we'd go through and make sure the QA folks knew what they were doing with the audit. But you said that we're going from basically a developer directly into production. Where in the middle between developer and production can we put these stop gaps or these checkpoints where we can put these things in? And with the high velocity of deployments, how can we say, okay, you've just put something in there that's broke everything. You need to stop the presses and go back, because there's no back in DevOps. It's always forward. There's no back.
Yeah, that was actually one of the, so I'll go to your last point first and then go back from there, which is, the rollbacks and everything like that. Early on in that process, I got introduced to a term that I really liked, which is roll forward, right? Which for a lot of times, if you can detect an issue like that, it's actually quicker in a lot of those environments to just deploy a fix than it is to revert the change in the first place. That's not always the case, especially as you discover kind of architectural level issues or bigger performance issues or security issues or just bugs in general that can be bigger. Obviously, rolling back might be the right move there. But the interesting thing is, it definitely saw cases where we'd discover a sort of security issue and it was faster just fix that and go forward. Right. To the larger point, I think that you were kind of talking about in the beginning of, you go from these natural sort of gatekeeping points to the process has changed so fundamentally that doesn't exist anymore. And so the question really becomes, do you stop doing security because of that, or how does it change? And the reality is that you don't stop doing security, just like you don't stop doing testing, you don't stop looking at performance or anything like that. It just fundamentally changes from basically these kind of outsourced groups to making those capabilities really self-serve for the development organization and the DevOps organization. This is something I really passionately believe, which is that security, what's going to define effective security over the coming decade plus is security focusing on making the development teams and the DevOps teams security self-sufficient. And so security organizations, their role changes from being this kind of outsourced group that people kick code over the wall to try to make it secure and kick it back, to instead security focuses on, hey, how do we give the development teams and DevOps teams the tooling and the techniques directly so that they can self-serve on a lot of this? And security is trying to strategically bring those capabilities across the organization.
Okay.
That's exactly right.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I said that. I mean, that's exactly right. That's been my experience as well. And if you're working for a company that's talking about DevOps, or you're trying to, I don't know, learn new things in security, how to make a development company secure, if you're not embracing DevOps, you're going to be kicked to the curb. Yeah. I mean, that's just the reality. That's the future of development shops now, today.
Yeah,
right.
Totally agree. I think that we're at this inflection point, and in that talk, I think I called it this kind of existential crisis point in security, in the same way kind of IT procurement groups were about 7 or 8 years ago at the start of the rise of cloud, which is if you were an app developer or a DevOps, back then it was a SysOps team, not a DevOps team. But if you were some sort of team like that and you needed new infrastructure for a project that you're working on or a new application or something like that, and you had to requisition servers and it took 8 months or 13 months to get those servers, and then suddenly you could just put a credit card down with a cloud provider and spin up 8 instances in 2 minutes. It became this existential crisis point for them that if they didn't stop being these blockers, then people would just route around them. And so security, very much like you were just saying, security is at this point where if we can't change the way that we've interacted with the rest of the organization to really help enable and embrace that shift to DevOps and cloud, then the business isn't going to stop, right? They're not going to say, oh, let's wait for security on there. They're going to keep going. And ultimately that means routing around security, which is a result in which no one wins.
Mm-hmm. Or you'll be rendered obsolete and they'll get somebody who will embrace these changes. Right? Sure.
So, we've had Martin Fisher on, who's a CISO and also was on the Southern Fried Security podcast, and he brought the idea of the guardrail versus the speed bump thing. So in DevOps, we're not actually a guardrail or a speed bump. We're going to be the one, like the driving instructor, helping the developer not hit the guardrails in the first place, right? We're going to be more an advisory role, more of a almost more like a PM that would go, and watch for various items that come up, whether or not they're, security based or should. Is that a proper analogy?
I think that's a decent analogy. And the piece I would add on is like the driving instructor helping out there, but we're also for the first time, we're putting all of the dashboard instruments in front of the driver instead of in front of the instructor or someone in the back seat, right? If we think about the security controls that we've used in the past, they've mostly been used directly by they've been consumed by the security team. And really, I think the fundamental shift in tooling and techniques is making these security resources where they can be directly consumed by the driver themselves in this analogy, right? That you don't want just the driving instructor having a speedometer. You also want the driver to be able to see how fast they're going and results and everything there.
Right. So I'm going to ask a question because one of our Patreon guys, his name is David, and he also runs our book club. He was the one who suggested we bring you on. He's got some questions. So he said, what is the job of security team? So I kind of answered that one. So if DevOps with security is done right, do you still need a security team? And if so, what do they do? Or do they write more code?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks, David, for giving them a shout and asking them to be on. Maybe you just wanted to heckle me further or something like that. And when I say something dumb here, but either way, hopefully it's useful. But no, the question being, do security teams go away? No, definitely security teams don't go away. I mean, you talk to any security organization on the planet, and everyone has the opposite problem, which is no one can find enough. Everyone has so much open headcount right now that no one can hire for. Right. But that's the challenge facing us. And so what's funny is it all kind of weaves back to the same solution, which is the only way that we actually scale is by empowering those teams directly. So I think to the question, it's really that security roles adapt over time, right? Which is exactly what you'd expect. If you still have a security person doing the exact same thing that they were doing in 1996, like that's indicative of the system being broken more than anything else. And so it's about security adapting in the same way that development is adapting, in the same way that sysops groups and their roles have become DevOps focused and everything, right? All this is technology. We're still at an early stage of this, and as far as human history here, right? And so security is really adapting with this over time as well.
Cool. So feel free to get in here, Miss Amanda, if you want to, because you look thrilled, So
all right, Zane.
I'm trying to wake up.
What security verticals are going to be sort of with the cloud and the DevOps and all that coming rendered obsolete in the near future, right? In a dev shop.
What's funny is I was having this conversation actually this morning with a CTO, like a major, like Fortune 500 CTO. And what was funny is we really got to the exact same point out of this, which is that the way that we've thought about security spend in particular and security technologies, I think fundamentally shifts in two really profound ways. One is the piece that I've been talking a lot about, which is that it goes from the security team being the user to the development teams and the DevOps teams being the user and kind of the end user of that. But the other side is that so much of the security industry has been built around infrastructure security for so long, right? You go put down the firewall, you go put down the IDS and the DMZ and everything like that for your 3-tier architecture. And what really changes, and I think what we're really starting to see this just fundamental titanic shift going on, is that when we step back and look from the attack perspective, the attacks have changed, but the security spend hasn't actually caught up yet with how it shifted, which is that if you were an attacker 10 years ago, 15 years ago, I say this as former, I'll say reformed pen tester, you went and attacked the infrastructure, right? It is how you got at the data. But if you're attacking as a modern attacker attacking an organization, your objective is still to get that data, but that data really lives up at the application layer now. So you go attack the applications and the APIs and the microservices, or you attack the endpoints, right, via phishing or anything like that. And so the attackers, they're not changing because they want to, they're changing because they have to, and that's where the data now lives. And so I think our security programs, and by extension, our security spend and the security product market and everything like that, is just starting to begin that really large scale shift, which is that, do you need to go buy that extremely heavy firewall and IDS when you move to the cloud? Well, where do you even plug it in first place, right? Yeah. And more importantly, is that where you're still seeing attacks? And for the most part, it's no, the firewall's configured to go open up 80 and 443 because that's what you have to let through. That's where the data now lives. So how do we actually defend those applications? And from the other side of things, how do we defend our endpoints? Because those two buckets are really where the attackers have shifted to. And that's what we've got to be thinking about from the defense perspective is, not just wearing our compliance hats, but actually thinking about where do our attackers go at the end of the day.
Yeah. And I think that's something you mentioned in your talk about triaging the vulnerabilities that are your most important to your least important. If you're a heavy web application front end kind of company like the Amazons or the Googles or the eBays out there that they live and die by their web interface being up, things like cross-site scripting, CSRF, SQL injection, those things are important and they need to be isolated and fixed as soon as possible, or first in this case. Whereas things like architecturally or business logic they are important, but they're not something that can be easily fixed within a deployment cycle.
Yeah, and the interesting thing there is I think how much has expanded from, exactly to your point, how much has expanded from those kind of traditional web companies to just the Fortune 500 in general. If you're a modern enterprise, you interact with your customers via some sort of web application at this point. It might be a mobile app, with a web service backing it. It might be an API. It might be a web application or a traditional kind of marketing website or something like that. But the reality is you probably have all of the above. And so what you're really facing in the trenches that I think that we've all kind of lived through is that the threats from that perspective of what actually keeps you up at night has really expanded and in a lot of ways shifted from the traditional XSS and SQLi and everything there. Those are still important, very much so.
Sure.
But what really keeps me up at night as a CISO thinking about defending web applications, and there's the application misuse and the business logic and the account takeover and that kind of full spectrum of threats that we actually face at that level.
Yeah.
And I think that has kind of adapted over time, as well as for organizations, they've got more of these applications and APIs, and it's just kind of continuously increasing in terms of their usage.
And what about software-defined networks? Where do they play in? I mean, are they going to be a much more important role? Does development then control the network infrastructure as well? And we have to basically add that to our repertoire or our syllabus for developer training, right?
Yeah, I think with all of those, the lens that I've kind of learned to see it through is that all of these things which actually enable business velocity, we're likely to see more and more adoption of. For any given vendor or given technology or something like that, that's where, kind of finger in the air, who knows what's going to be the right thing. But the lens I've learned to kind of see it through, just because by getting it wrong so many times before I start to see it, is these things that enable the business to move quicker generally get adopted. I think it's really why we saw the rise of DevOps, why we're starting to see security show up to the party there and say like, okay, yeah, we really need to adapt to this as well. And so to your question on SDN and everything like that, I think it will likely get used in different ways by different organizations. But for those that find it easier to enable them to move quicker because of it, I think it's probably there to stay for those organizations.
Right. So one of the slides you had in your talk was the various parts that could be used to increase security, and one of them was static analysis and dynamic scanning, and you put those together, and you mentioned the 10,000 page scanning report and how when you're in waterfall.
Oh my gosh, I just had to deal with one of those the other day.
Really?
Exactly.
Okay, so his point in the talk was that a 10,000 page thing was, you could get rid of a lot of it in 16 months when you were doing, a release every 18 months. But now they're not even going to look at this because there's just so much junk in the way, which is why he mentioned getting rid of.
They didn't even look at the summary, so I don't know that it really mattered.
Well, was it a 5-page summary? Because if it's 5,
yeah, I mean, it wasn't too awful bad. I mean, they could have at least read the high stuff.
Well, okay, so there's 10,000 pages. What if there's 150 pages of highs? I mean, it goes
like in the summary, like the 5-page summary, they could have read the criticals and the highs would have been helpful too, but
okay.
Whatever.
Well, so are you in a DevOps environment, Ms. Berlin?
No, not really.
Will you be moving towards that?
That's not anything that I ever have to worry about.
Oh, good.
At least with my position.
Okay.
Mine's more research and stuff.
Okay.
Threat research, kind of.
Okay.
Doing a lot with Carbon Black.
Oh, all right. This show is not brought to you by Carbon Black. So, okay. So CI and CD and DevOps. Why did you call them out as being different in your talk, or are they the same?
I think there's a lot of overlap between the two. I think that it's one of those where these are terms that you ask. It's kind of the old joke, right? You ask 10 people what they mean and you'll get 15 different answers.
Right.
I think it's very much that. And so I think for some organizations, they are absolutely one and the same. For most organizations, they're one and the same. I think sometimes I've seen people use them to mean different things. But these are terms that are still, fairly new for some organizations. And so sometimes organizations take them to mean different things. The reality is it's all part of the same shift, right? The same shift that's going on here, which is enabling velocity. And CI/CD, DevOps, any of that, it's really part of the same kind of generational shift that we're going through in the way that we create and deliver applications.
Yeah. So we were talking about triaging vulnerabilities earlier, and, we recorded this on the 12th of September, and, the whole thing with Equifax, I'm going to call it Equifax. Please tell me if I called Experian or whatever, because I just re-listened to that show and I'm just awful. So Equifax has been breached. There was some rumors that it was based on specific vulnerability in struts. Now, there's nothing verified yet. There still isn't anything verified yet as of the 12th. Does the security landscape change depending on what's the new hotness in the vulnerability world? And, how do you get your developers to understand that and go, okay, well, SQL injection is not the new hotness this year. It's struts vulnerabilities, or it's JSON issues, or it's XXE with XML. I mean, how do you get them to shift gears and understand that? Is it education, and how do you educate them when they're pushing out product every 3 days?
Mm-hmm. So I think the kind of strategic view to take here is, no matter what the new hotness of the day or the breach of the day is or anything like that, getting, constantly jumping on that is not really how you think about building a strategic security.
Right.
It's, I would say the bigger shift to think about here that you kind of alluded to in your question is, and that we talked about in the previous one, is this, what is the real strategic shift going on? And that's kind of from infrastructure up to the application layer and out to the endpoint side of things and everything there. So how I think about adapting security programs over time is much less with whatever the new hotness of the day is or anything there, but is that, how do we keep the focus on the important strategic areas that we're shifting a lot of our, especially for those of us in organizations that have had security programs for 5 years or 10 years or anything like that, how do we adapt their focus to where we're really actually seeing the threats today? And trying to not get lost in the noise. Don't worry, your vendors' marketing programs, I'm sure, will happily talk about the latest things and everything there. But the reality for those of us in the kind of defensive trenches is that you're trying to take this strategic view and not just whatever the new hotness of the day is.
Right.
On that, you said that attacks have changed, and I've kind of seen that. I mean, in years past, the web applications were the way into a company, and then there's been a big push into patching these things, move to the cloud, so sort of auto patching, auto updates, things like that. And they've shifted more to the endpoints to get into an organization. Now it's with the new endpoint, the next gen AV, stuff like that, it's harder to compromise an endpoint. So what are they doing? Are they moving to try and compromise like an endpoint developer and then pushing code out from there?
Yeah, I think we're still in the midst of that heavyweight shift from infrastructure up to web application endpoint, to be quite honest. I think for most attackers, when you hit those two kind of sides of a target, basically, today, you're still getting in through one of those because of the lack of visibility and the lack of a kind of overall control that we have there as defenders. So I don't think they've, unfortunately had to move past those yet. I think they've kind of iterated their techniques and things like that. Because I think, to your point, the way that you compromised a web application 5-10 years ago and the way you do it today is definitely different. And same thing with an endpoint, right? But I think that this overall shift from the attack perspective, we're still, I think more than anything, seeing the shift from infrastructure up to application and out to endpoint. And so then as they're making that shift, we're going to see them refine their techniques inside each group, right? And I think that's kind of what you were alluding to there, is that, yeah, we're always going to see them refining their techniques in there, but I think that overall shift is very much what we're seeing today.
Nice.
All right. Now, you said you went in to Etsy, and you're going from waterfall to DevOps. I mean, can you tell us a success story you had, something that really gave you a big, pat on the back, like, yeah, we're finally getting this?
Yeah, I actually can, because there's one that's public, so I actually get to be open about the details.
Oh, sweet.
It's awesome. And you can actually look it up on, I can send a link, so you can put it in the show notes and everything here. But there was actually a post that was done up on a Reddit NetSec post years and years ago, which is that we started thinking about, defending our web applications and APIs and services that we were exposing there. And we tried a bunch of things didn't work, and we found a bunch of things that did, and we got kind of visibility over that. And we had this scenario that was honestly one of the prouder moments of my AppSec career, which is that we were able to detect in this one scenario where an attacker had discovered a vulnerability and was still working on refining their exploit payload. And we detected that they discovered the vuln and were able to push a fix before they even reported anything to us. So they were still like iterating on that payload there because we had a bunch of visibility in place. And so the attacker actually turned out to be a bug bounty researcher, and they were awesome. And they actually wrote in and said, hey, I went to go retest this thing before I sent it into you, and suddenly it's not working. I can't imagine that's a coincidence, because this is a endpoint buried super deep off in your API somewhere. And so I just wanted to write it in, so you didn't think I was a real attacker. And by the way, I was also testing from my home IP. And so
that's nice.
Not a smart
attacker. Really fun back and forth with them of kind of details, and it was a really great experience. And they actually wrote up their take on it and their side of it up in this link that I'll, like I said, I'll send in.
Cool.
But
Nice.
that was a really exciting moment. And I'll actually give you a different side of it, which was a different incident, which is that we were able to detect kind of similar start, where we were able to detect an attacker discovering a vulnerability. We were able to see that it wasn't via automation or something. They were manually poking, they found something, they started refining a payload, they got a working exploit for it, and then they just went away. They didn't report it, they didn't use it. We looked back over time, they hadn't used it in the past. And that was really crazy for us. That was a real whoa moment where we felt very lucky that we had, invested in getting kind of new ways of visibility over our applications and APIs, that we were able to really detect this. And it wasn't something that they reported in.
How did you detect it?
Yeah, so there were, this is where I'll get, unfortunately, a little hand wavy, just for
That's
some
fine.
of that. But it was really getting visibility at that application layer to understand the attacks and the anomalies that they would generate in the applications that we were defending, in the APIs that we were defending, so that we could start to detect when attackers were actually successfully discovering vulnerabilities.
So you had some strong logging going on, or what was the deal there?
We had started with logging, and we built it out into a much more advanced feature set over time to really be able to look at a bunch of things there. The reality on the ground, right, is that no one needs an alert every time somebody attempts a SQL injection or an XSS against you. I mean, you get 1 million of those a day, every day on the internet. What we were actually able to be really successful with is starting to think about, okay, well, we want coverage over when any of those attempted attacks are actually triggering real issues in the applications themselves or the APIs or anything there. So there's a bunch of devil in the details about, if we had 3 hours for this, we'd get to go into a ton of fun stuff, but just...
So can you give me an example of an issue?
Yeah, so, starting to match up things like saying, okay, I don't care if somebody throws 1 million SQL injection attempts against me. Alert me anytime one actually triggers a 500 error in my application, right? I want to know when it starts to trigger real bugs, because I don't even care if it's exploitable at that point. I want to know right away if something discovers a real issue.
Right.
Shouldn't a WAF do that?
You would think, and yet the incredible frustration that we had with trying to adapt WAFs to DevOps and cloud is actually, funny story, why we built Signal Sciences, is that lessons learned out of that was we turned it into a product so that we could actually help other folks with exactly what
well, most WAFs just look for or 1 = 1. So if you use
exactly.
or 2 = 2, if you use 2 = 2, then that just totally defeats the rule set altogether.
Exactly.
Yeah,
that's great.
Exactly.
That's
I mean,
right.
we've all seen the ridiculous challenges with trying to deploy like legacy WAFs and everything there.
Yep.
It's yeah.
So
I'll leave it at that.
So I want to get back to the DevOps thing. There are some negatives to using DevOps. There's, nobody likes to document anything. Developers want to code. They don't want to write documentation. Data flow diagrams are woefully inadequate most times at many places I've talked about. And these are things that security people need to go, okay, how does data X get to destination Y and whatever? How, short of the security people actually having to do it ourselves, can we get the developers to actually slow down or maybe, get half the team to do development, or maybe you put that in as part of the cycle? How do you get them to do the necessary stuff to help security help them?
Yeah. So this is kind of, I'd say, to the other side of the SDLC, which is around your kind of design, design review and threat modeling and everything like that, right? And how do you get the resources that you need? The good thing is that it feels like DevOps would totally upend a bunch of that. The reality that I've seen is actually the planning phases for a lot of this don't change that. Like the planning phases still exist. So that's the good news, right? Is that people, just because you have systems in place that allow your developers to deploy multiple times a day, they're not building that feature overnight and shipping it that day, right? It still takes time to build features. You're still working with your product groups and things like that. And so for security, I think it becomes, as the process changes, where maybe there's no longer the requirement to build a data flow diagram or some sort of tool like that. The process may have changed, but so much of the actions are actually still there. So the good news for security is that, okay, maybe in the waterfall model, you got a data flow diagram at this point in the process, and you're no longer getting that. Well, the good news is actually, if you go talk to the product organization or the developers and say, hey, when do you do your planning for your features? Now, instead of it being 8 months out, it's 2 months out maybe, but it's still actually happening. And so security needs to adapt, but the resources they need actually haven't gone away. They've just changed.
Cool. Yeah, I'm just thinking about, when auditors come in, because you have to follow some kind of auditing capacity, and they ask you, how are you doing backups? And you're like, oh, you're so sweet. We use AWS instances and cold storage, so there are no backup tapes. And they look at you, because that happens to me quite a bit. We have customers that haven't embraced the cloud thing yet, and they're like, where do you put your tape backups? And we're like, you're so cute. Look at you. The 1998 call. So,
exactly. Yeah, no, I think that's...
there's some people still doing tape backups.
I know. I apologize.
Yeah, I think that's the other side of this, right? Which is the compliance and the regulatory regimes and everything like that, and how do they adapt? And by their very nature, they're kind of a trailing control instead of a leading control. And so the reality of how they adapt is it's messy. Yeah, definitely.
But as somebody who fills out questionnaires and makes millions of dollars for his company because I'm helping the salespeople close deals, ABC, always be closing. I get coffee all the time. You get these questionnaires and they're like, oh, we'd like to see data flow diagrams. We'd like to see network diagrams. And we're like, look, okay. We technically have them, but we can't really give them to you because reasons, national security or something. It's hard to walk that line when you know that we don't follow that kind of methodology anymore, and we can give you, here's a block and here's a block and we have things that go between it, but they want like really, really in-depth kind of old school diagrams. And that's just not possible with DevOps-y type environments, I think, unless you're doing it at the offset. So.
Yeah. And I think a lot of these kind of second order, I completely agree with your point, which is a lot of these kind of second order processes to our security programs are going to have to adapt as well, right? Which is, how do we communicate compliance questionnaires to customers or do a certain compliance regime or anything like that? Yep. And I think we're just so early in this mass migration to DevOps and cloud that no one has a great answer there yet. People are kind of finding what works for their organization and their customers and everything there. But I certainly haven't talked to anyone that I feel like that they would say that they found a silver bullet. It's kind of, it's iteration.
It's ad hoc. More than anything else. It depends on each organization to do their own thing and what works for them. So So you talked about bug bounties a couple times there. You had a couple of scenarios that you were talking about. So in your talk, you mentioned that you can use bugs that are found as part of your IR or incident response tabletops or whatever. Could you maybe discuss a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so this was something that I found bug bounties to be tremendously useful for, which is that you can use them as kind of the start of a feedback loop into your security, like security ops process, your DFIR, your just an overall feedback loop into how you do what I've always kind of called like attack-driven defense, right? Which is not defense off in isolation, but defending against the real attacks and real threats that we actually face. And so what I found very effective for that is if you take a vulnerability report that comes in from a bug bounty and say, okay, what if we had found out about this and the attacker was actually hostile, right? And so what would we do? How would we be able to triage this effectively? How would we be able to look back and see, has anyone else exploited it? Or has this attacker actually found 6 other things and they're just reporting like the lowest severity one and actually keeping the other 5 for themselves? So you start to ask yourself these questions and you get really uncomfortable if you're honest with yourself about the answers at first. Right. And the really useful thing out of that is that uncomfortableness is fantastic because it lets you know immediately where to be investing your time and your resources in iterating your program, right? The first time you ask yourself that question of how can we look back and see if someone else has discovered this in the last 6 months? For almost every organization on the planet, the answer is you can't. And then that's great. That starts to now think about, okay, cool, we're using this. We're learning these lessons in a benign incident. We're not learning these lessons when the house is actually on fire.
Yeah. We talked about that last week in our IR tabletop podcast that we did where you can't play the blame game. You have to sometimes tell the truth that, yes, we don't do something and that, we find these issues all the time, and that's what the lessons learned is for.
Oh no, that won't work because we don't actually have backups.
Yeah. So, okay, the process is then to start doing backups, whether it be in Amazon or you go down to Fry's or whatever it is, electronics store, and buy some DAT, So, that's pretty true right there.
So you gave that
pretty
guy
secure that way.
a little change, right, for discovering that vulnerability.
Even though
you patched it.
Yeah, exactly. Actually, one of the things with that I was most proud of with our bug bounty program was that that actually happened before we had a bug bounty program. And when we launched our bug bounty program, we went back and retroactively rewarded everybody who reported something up to that.
Very cool.
Nice.
No, I mean, that's the cool thing about bug bounty programs, right, is that I think everyone rightfully has a lot of concerns when they're first thinking about it, like, oh, we're going to get a bunch of like malicious stuff in here. Like, what's that going to look like? There's always outliers. You're always going to get some sort of things like that. But the vast majority of folks there are actually really trying to help. Yep. And when you recognize that they're really coming from a good spot, it really helps. Now, I'm certainly not going to say there's not a lot of noise. There is plenty of noise, but that's where the programs like, HackerOne and BugCrowd and folks like that, they really help with so many of the things that were really challenging for us at the time when we had a bug bounty program when none of that existed. Mm-hmm. And so we had to deal with all of the logistical overhead that was just a nightmare. And so they really help out with a bunch of that. And so I really, having lived through a bug bounty program from all sides and being a former pen tester and everything there, I really like bug bounty programs. And I also like them because I think they augment pen test very well. I don't think one replaces the other. I think the two augment each other incredibly well.
Very nice. Very nice. So one of the last things, unless Miss Berlin, Mr. Betcher have anything, is you mentioned setting up things like when you're talking about your logging, but you also talked about alerting on certain things, like if you've got, if you know where your sensitive data is, or where your sensitive files are to various things, and you have a repo and your developers touch one of those files, you can set up alerts, or you should set up alerts that would say, okay, yeah, this file was changed, and this is like a mega important file. This will notify 8 or 9 people. And the idea is if that file gets a lot of attention and, 5 people are notified that file was changed, a developer would be less likely to touch that file unless there was absolutely a major reason to do so. I thought that was really good, but I mean, is that possible if you have several million lines of code and several hundred files? I mean, that would get wieldy after a while, where you get a lot of false positives. Or
totally, if you're just trying to do that as a general approach, that would fall over at scale, like at the first moment of scale. What you kind of do with that, and to add a little context there, I think is that you can pick out for any application type, regardless of scale, there's always going to be those sections that are kind of very security sensitive, right? It might be the way that you generate session cookies, or the way that you do certain wrappers for encryption, or things like that typically get written very early on in an application's lifetime and then updated almost never. And so those primitives are really kind of, from a high enough level, the same across all applications. Now, how, what the actual file names are is of course different, and the technologies are different, but how we do session management, or how we do encryption wrappers, or how we do a file system operation or something like that, that's pretty much the same. And so what you can do, and what that solution, like I'll give you a very specific problem that it solves, is as a security organization, when you have one of those sensitive files that very rarely changes, like your session management, code or something like that, the old way of doing things might be, okay, before you can change this file, it's actually blocked from any changes, and you need sign off from these 3 people, and they have to, through your through a certain code repo, they've got to sign off on it or something like that.
Right.
What you see as you start to shift to DevOps or something there is that control. Let's say you have an outage, and they need to, your SREs or your DevOps engineers or something actually need to make that change, and a security control just blocked them from doing it at 3 a.m. in the middle of an outage. What do you think is the first thing that gets ripped out at 8 a.m. the next day?
Right.
It's all of those security controls.
Yep.
And so the way that you can rethink this problem to get the same coverage, but in a way that's not going to get ripped out the first time it causes an issue, is to say, okay, for these sensitive files, you can change them, but they're going to notify these 5 senior architects and the CTO and the these senior folks across the organization. So if you're an SRE at 3 a.m. responding to an incident, you say, yeah, that's fine. They're already paged anyway about this incident. That's no big deal. But if you're a junior developer editing the wrong file by mistake, and it says you're about to page the CTO with that, you are going to back that change out incredibly quickly. And so you still enable the velocity of DevOps while keeping the security controls that we actually need. And I think that's the biggest thing to be thinking about as a security professional in an organization going through these changes, is not how do we get rid of controls, it's how do we adapt them to this new environment.
Yeah. So do code repo systems like Git or whatever hell the other ones are out there, do they have that ability in it, or is that some kind of third-party bit that has to be added?
It kind of depends on the individual one and how you actually want to alert and everything like that. Devil's in the details there.
Right.
But I've seen folks do it with all sorts of different source control and everything.
Okay.
So.
How granular can that get? Can you say, well, okay, they edited this file and added this bit of code, like a system or exec VE or something like that, where they added a possible vulnerability? Okay, this is something that, or should this be something that should be flagged for an additional check by another dev before it goes into production?
Yeah, I think the short answer there is yes to all of the above, right? You can get granular, you can flag other things. I'd say that's actually kind of 2 distinct buckets to think about, which is overall sensitive pieces of the application changing is one bucket, and another bucket is, okay, very high risk things coming in, like an exec call, or they are low frequency and high risk. Like those are your best signals, right? Because your signal to noise ratio is spectacular.
Fantastic.
Can you talk a little bit about, I'm going to hit reverse here for a second.
Okay.
You said that bug bounty programs and pen testers augment each other.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about how I can, well, I know how bug bounty programs work, but a pen tester you can have a pen tester come in and do all kinds of things, right? They can do dynamic analysis. They can do, they can look at your code. They can do a code audit. They can look at your architecture. They can do a lot of things. How can I best, if I'm already thinking about or have a bug bounty program, how do I get the most bang for my buck with a pen tester? What do they need to stay away from so as not to overlap? And what do I need them to focus on?
Totally. Great question. I say, from having lived through it from many angles, which is that, so I'm going to give kind of the longer answer of how we have traditionally used pen test to set up the context, and then hit that dead on, which is we traditionally use pen test in a way where we're kind of damned if we do, damned if we don't. because you can either use them, you're always budget constrained, right? No matter who you are. So you can either have your pen testers go deep on one particular area or go shallow across a bunch of it. And so why I really feel that bounty and pen tests can augment each other is that in the general case, I think bounty does a very good job of going general and going broad. And sometimes you can incentivize them to be deep on certain areas, but for the most part, like, the general case is you're going to get really good broad coverage. Now it frees up your pen testers where you can focus them like a laser on certain key points to say, okay, I want you to really focus on this API or this functionality that's totally pre-released that we haven't gotten to yet or anything there. And you don't have to use your pen testers for general broad testing anymore. You can focus them on key particular areas. And oftentimes it's kind of the deeper, the better there, and use your bounty to give you that kind of broad general feedback loop.
Awesome. Okay.
My last question is, I'd like for you to talk about security people embracing this change, right? That's going on. I kind of hearken it to, if you're a 23-year-old truck driver today, you're in trouble. And if you're not,
especially if you're listening to this podcast,
looking for
wow. Okay.
If you're not looking for other opportunities, then you're going to be hosed in a few years because self-driving trucks, that's coming, right? And you're going to be out of job real soon. Yep. What about us? What about security teams? What do we have to stay away from, get out of the way of, right? Things like that. Where do we need to go?
I think the good news here is that so much of what I think you have to adapt as a security person that's kind of seeing this change coming and everything is the soft skills, right? It's the ability to talk with these teams and not function as a blocker and to be able to be much more interactive with the teams without, saying no as a default policy. So does the technology change? Absolutely. And again, you need to learn new skill sets around, new security tools and everything there. Absolutely. But I'd say the fundamental change, which is both, good and bad, is that, or easy and hard rather than good and bad, is that so much of the way of the process of how security people have interacted with the rest of the organization, that's the big thing to change. It's that kind of cultural interaction. And so, for some folks that's easy, for some folks that's hard, but that's where I would actually start. And the technical skills, so much of us in the security profession, like the technical bit is the easy bit for a lot of us, right? You can learn a new tool, you can learn a new technique and everything there. I'd say that the one takeaway I'd say on that side, like the highest level takeaway is don't go so deep in the weeds on just trying to adjust the technical side. Absolutely adjust your technical skill set, but also think about if security is no longer functioning as this gatekeeper and actually has to really focus on buy-in and really focus on making these teams security self-sufficient, be thinking about how to change culture as well.
Mm. Yeah, it seems more like you're almost heading towards more of a security kind of manager thing where you're doing like PM work. You have to understand how to speak to developers in such a way that they understand it, and also thinking strategically, because some of the changes you're going to be doing, the new strategic is going to be 10 iterations down the road, not just 18 months. So you have to think, well, okay, in 10 iterations, we're going to be able to put this out, or, and then keeping up on those, those priorities and making them priority in each iteration.
Totally agree there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Explaining why things are important. I mean, developers are going to get it. They're in general, they're really smart. They understand the technical aspects of how to do it, but it's just trying to get them to understand why it's important.
Yeah, I think that's
why it's needed for business.
Yeah, totally agree. I think that's for security, for internal security teams. What's interesting is your job is almost becoming a internal security consultant, right? Yeah. Whereas the security consultants were always external to the organization before, the security teams, they focus now on how do we make those teams the engineering teams security self-sufficient, and so kind of functioning as a consultant in a lot of ways internally.
Nice. Ms. Berlin, Mr. Betcher, do you have any other questions? Because I think that's probably a good place to stop. We've kind of come full circle.
No, not that I can think of.
Is that right?
Yes, I think
full
it was.
Full circle?
Right on. Okay, well, we're at we're at about the hour mark here. So, Mr. Zane, Mr. Lackey, how would people get a hold of you if they wanted to discuss signal sciences, or they wanted to talk about, DevOps, sec, DevOps, sec, dev, sec.
Yeah, so I'd say there's two sides there. The vendor Signal Sciences side and everything like that. We're signalsciences.com. You can go request a demo. You can take a look at our info and our customers and everything like that. And for me personally, and I'll actually separate this out here, which is that if you have interest in this space of DevOps security and the kind of lessons learned around it and shifting to cloud and everything like that, I think the more that we're all sharing our lessons learned with each other, right? The reality is we're all facing the same challenges. So the more that we can be helping each other, the better. My email is zane@signalsciences.com. I also actually set my DMs on Twitter to be open. So just drop me a line. I'm actually really always happy to chat about this subject because I firmly believe the more that we're helping each other and sharing lessons learned, the better.
Cool. So you speak at several places. You're going to be speaking anywhere in the near future?
I'll actually be out at ISSA in San Diego in October. I'll be at SANS also in October in Denver, I believe it is.
Nice.
And I think there's a few after that, but I've stopped looking multiple months out at my calendar at this point.
Yeah. No, that's cool. I know some people in San Diego that will enjoy that. I'll see if we can get them on our Slack and let them know you're coming. So they'll
fantastic.
ISSA meeting. That's awesome. So, Ms. Berlin, if people wanted to discuss blue teaming and, your hurting eyeballs, how would they go about doing so?
On Twitter at Infosister, INFOSYSTIR.
Cool. Mr. Betcher, same question to you. Mr. Lackey, Mr. Betcher has a vested interest in understanding logging. He has a program called LogMD that he enjoys using and creating.
Really?
He's the head developer. He's
awesome.
All into the DevOps and stuff.
I've never heard of this LogMD.
I know, right?
The DevOps of the LogMD. Yes, log-md.com.
Yeah.
That's where you can get a hold of me, right?
Right on. So the official podcast Twitter is @Breaksec, BRAKSEC. You can follow me, Brian Brake, on Twitter using my first and last name, Brian Brake, BRYANBRAKE. I hang out a lot on Twitter. I hang out a lot on our Slack channel. Our Slack, we have a Slack group. If you want to join us and talk about DevOps or malware,
a giant Slack group.
It's rather large. It is. That's what she said. It's 683 people so far. It fluctuates, but if you're interested in doing that, we had a lot of great.
There's only 4 people active.
Is there only 4 people?
No.
We had some discussion on SE Linux today. We were talking about the job board. We have some pen testing and red teaming discussions on there. I mean, we just got done with our PowerShell class with McDouglas, and we're sitting down with our instructor at DerbyCon to do the Intro to Reverse Engineering and Debugging course. He's a malware researcher, so I'm hoping that we'll get to poke around on some malware. So I'm looking forward to sitting down with him and discussing the syllabus for that. But you can join us on our Slack at breaksec.signup.team. And we have people all over the world on there. All 24 time zones are 28 time zones or how many ever's in there. So it's
really,
yeah. I sent a here on the general chat, and it was like, hey, you're about to send this to 700 people inside 28 time zones. I'm like, probably somebody's sleeping. I probably don't want to send that right now. So,
yeah.
Yeah,
I've silenced everything.
Oh, wow.
So it doesn't matter to me, but
Wowzers.
I'm sure other people would get pissed.
Yeah, that would be very.
I did a here. Didn't I do a here? I did a here or a channel or something.
You did for the poll. You did for the poll
right.
where we're going to meet.
Nobody yelled at me.
Yeah. Oh, speaking of that,
they know better.
They do know better. On our Slack channel, we do have a DerbyCon channel. So if you're at DerbyCon and you want to just meet up with people or talk to people who are BreakSec members, we do have a DerbyCon channel that is dedicated for that. So you don't have to know people's phone numbers or wire up the Telegram signal thingies. Just get up on the DerbyCon channel and do an @ here or something. So, I mean, we've got about, 20 people in there right now? Yeah, about 20 people. So,
or all of us will be at the bar.
Most of us will be at the bar, yeah. So, I think that was it for this week. We're on Patreon. Thank you to our Patreon members. Thank you to David for mentioning that. He
had some good questions.
He did have some excellent questions. We're going to leave those in the show notes. So, we're on iTunes. If you want to support us on Patreon, you can leave us a little something in a tip jar. We believe in the value for value model. We're on the Google Play Store, TuneIn Radio, iHeartRadio apps. There's pretty much nowhere you can't find us. We have an RSS feed.
Fine podcasts are aggregated.
Yes. We know you have other podcasts, but we appreciate you listening to ours. So that was it for this week on Breaking Down Security. We will be at DerbyCon next week, so if you are there, please come by and say hello. And you may buy us a drink.
Yes,
you may go ahead and buy us a drink.
I would not say no.
Yes, I will take a soft drink. So that was it. Everyone have a great week. Be nice to one another, and we will talk to you again real soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
All right, thank you.